Yeah. Okay, sorry. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Newman. I'm the postdoctoral research associate on the Addressing Health project. I'm currently based at King's College London. And for those of you who aren't aware of our project, we're a really fantastic project currently funded by the Wellcome, looking at health and occupational medicine in the post office in the Victorian and early Edwardian period. But before we joined the project, I spent quite a bit of time during my PhD researching and publishing on tuberculosis in the post office, which is what I'll be talking on today. And my association with U3A comes from my time on the Addressing Health project, where I've been working with a really fantastic group of people researching the life histories of postal pensioners who retired in 1901. So I'm really happy to come and talk with you all today. Let me start sharing my screen. Let's see. Yep. Oh. Okay. And I'll start now. So, yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to find where it, sorry, the Zoom thing keeps coming up. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, the title of my talk today is Transforming Tuberculosis, Tuberculosis, the Family in Scottish Medicine. And the reason I wanted to focus on the family unit here today is because of my time with the SLP, working with all these great family historians, I've had quite a few people talk to me about instances in their own family history research where they've come across cases of ancestors who died of tuberculosis or consumption. And I wanted to use today to sort of play around with this idea of tuberculosis in the family. So think about its relationship to the historical family unit, but also think about TB's own family history. So TB as something that, as a biological agent that has its own complicated long history and of stuff that you would kind of commonly associate with family history, so stuff to do with migration and so forth. So I wanted to play around with like the multiple levels and meanings of family as they relate to the history of medicine, and particularly with TB. And then finally kind of bring it back to Scottish medicine in particular, and that relation, the relationship of Scottish medicine to the post office. So yeah, so my talk is structured into 3 sections. I've tried to time this. It runs to around 40 minutes. So I'll try and not speak too quickly, but there's a lot to get through. So the first section looks at the family history of tuberculosis. Then we move more into the modern period, where I'm probably a lot more comfortable, if I'm being completely honest. It's my area of specialty. And then before, in the final section, looking at tuberculosis in Scotland and the relationship of Scottish tuberculosis medicine to the post office. Okay, so just a warning, there's only one slide this refers to actually. This presentation does include a graphic picture of one pathological specimen. Before this comes up, there'll be a little warning slide with this exclamation point. So look away if you want to. I will tell you when it's safe to look again. Okay, so now the first section looks at this idea of tuberculosis' own family history. So thinking of tuberculosis as a historical agent in its own right. So tuberculosis has an incredibly long and interesting genetic history. Tuberculosis was the first disease germ to ever be genetically sequenced. And so historians have done, not historians, scientists have done a lot of really interesting work on trying to trace the deep history of TB. And I'm concentrating a lot here today on Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which is the TB that you get from human to human transmission. But there are lots of different strains of tuberculosis that cause TB in mammals, some of which can cause TB in humans. So other tuberculosis strains, possibly the most famous of which is Mycobacterium bovis, which is what causes bovine TB, so TB in cattle, and you can get that from drinking infected milk. But I'm concentrating mostly on Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So it first emerged, just like humans, somewhere in East Africa. So that's the kind of where the cradle of life for TB, just as it was a cradle of life for humans. And what's interesting about TB is there are 7 major lineages of human tuberculosis that results from when humans first migrated from Africa. And what very, very clever scientists have done in a way that I couldn't possibly begin to explain to you how they did it, is they've sequence each different strain or lineage of TB and connect it with different migration patterns and different areas. But the modern strains of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, so the thing that most closely resembles TB today, excluding multi-drug resistant TB, first emerged around 20,000 years ago. And like I said, it is just one member of a much broader pathogenic family that causes TB in mammals. And tuberculosis, which some of you may know or may not, is predicted to have killed more humans than any other known pathogen. It's still a major killer today. People often forget this, but it's still a very, very big killer. And this is the phylogenetic tree of different types of TB. And again, I just think this is very, very cool. So this traces the very kind of complicated genetic history of TB. And what I like about this is the kind of parallels it has today with, you know, all these tests that you do on 23andMe or on Ancestry, tracing your genetic heritage. And people have already done that for TB. So you can see here the different kinds of strains of TB, the different lineages, and where these predominate in the world. And if you're interested, yeah, just Google phylogeny TB. It's very interesting. Okay, so this is the one instance where something a bit icky shows up. So if you guys aren't comfortable with looking at pathological materials, please look away now. Okay, so what makes TB in humans so distinctive and also so dangerous? So probably the most important thing to consider about TB is its latent infection. So TB actually takes a really long time to multiply in the body, actually much slower than a lot of other disease organisms. But what this does is if you're thinking about its history moving from East Africa to alongside humans, that's actually really good for its survival. That's really good. It doesn't die out quickly. It kind of incubates and hibernates, right? But this also leads to infection reservoirs. So it leads to cases where you've got these huge pool of people who have TB and are susceptible to TB. Another thing that makes tuberculosis distinctive and kind of dangerous is the multiple routes of infection. So primarily you get infected with TB through aerosol transmission, so through coughing or sneezing, for example. But you can also get it through food and drink. This is commonly associated with Mycobacterium bovis, which you can get from drinking unpasteurized infected milk, which, if we're sticking with the family history theme, is how my foster grandfather got TB in 1960s Lincolnshire from drinking raw milk from a farm. And the other thing that makes TB really distinctive and very dangerous is the fact that it can affect pretty much almost anywhere in the body. So the one that's most common and the one that people are most familiar with is pulmonary TB, so TB that affects the lungs. And we've got here a 19th century sample of a tubercular lung. And what tuberculosis, if you're thinking about like the kind of etymology of the word, it refers to tubercules, which are kind of nodules or cavities that can form anywhere on the body. So when they form in the lungs, you obviously get these huge cavities that show up in the lungs, which lead to all kinds of problems and often results in very advanced stages of the coughing up of blood as, you know, arteries and veins burst, etc., as the disease progresses. But there are other kinds of TB that can, again, spread. Tubercular meningitis, which is a really dangerous one, which affects the brain. Historically, this affected children quite a bit. Bone and joint TB. Actually, if you ever go to a pathology museum, so if this kind of thing doesn't bother you looking at samples like this, they often have examples of tubercular bones and joints, and you can see it's very, very distinctive, like little nodules and granulation on the bone, which really, like, it seems like an incredibly painful thing for someone to have lived with. Throat or laryngeal TB. So again, this was often associated with drinking infected milk because as you drank it, the germs kind of then made a home in your throat. The kidneys, the lymph nodes, and lots more. So it could affect your skin as well, for example. So it's really quite a clever little pathogen in a lot of ways, a clever little germ. Okay, so we're now sort of moving on. We're skipping forward many hundreds of years to the 19th century, which is where I'm probably a lot more comfortable really as a historian. I'm very much an interested layperson when it comes to things like the phylogenetics of TB. And I've included this image here because this is a postal history project, it's a postal history talk. I'm not actually super aware of how in the post-war period, stamps were used to fundraise for a lot of tuberculosis campaigns. And there's an interesting history there, one I haven't really had time to dig into that much. Yeah, whenever I can include stamps in this talk, I've tried to include stamps. And here again, I want to kind of return back to the theme of the families. So before the emergence of a theory of TB causation that included germs, so it included Mycobacterium tuberculosis, one of the most popular explanations for TB onset was the family and the idea of a hereditary transmission or predisposition towards TB. So think about it at this time, from the mid-19th century onwards, we get the Darwin's The Origins of Species, and that really influenced medicine to think more carefully about the role that hereditary factors play in disease. And so with TB, the idea was either it was transmitted directly from parent to child, but more often than not, it was this idea of a predisposition towards TB that you inherited, right? So you didn't directly inherit the disease, you inherited a predisposition towards it. And there were a number of exciting factors or that could trigger TB to eventually develop. And this included stuff like poor diet, alcohol abuse, an unhealthy environment, or an unknown contagion. So it's important to realize that before the TB germ was identified, there was still space in a lot of medical thinking for thinking about, there's probably an unknown biological agent that might be responsible for triggering TB. And I'm going to talk a bit more now about TB in 19th century Europe more generally. And before I do that, I'm going to turn my email off, which is very annoying. I do apologize to everyone for that. Before I get back to this, yes, so sorry. I usually do this in advance. Yes, okay, so TB in 19th century Europe. So TB in 19th century Europe undergoes a huge transformation in lots of different ways. So there's a demographic change, right? So the interesting thing about TB from the mid-19th century onwards is it's actually killing less and less people, and people are realizing that it's killing less and less people than before. But despite this, there's a huge amount of energy that gets invested in trying to fight TB in this period. And a huge amount of philanthropic energy and drive is directed towards eradicating the disease. And you've got here a fairly typical poster from the International Tuberculosis Exhibition in 1909. So this was a huge global movement, very much global in scale, that was dedicated to trying to rid the world of the menace of TB. So the reason why this is TB in this period really becomes a disease associated with a lot of anxieties about late 19th century society, particularly around class and medicine. So activists increasingly link TB to issues like the issue of housing, especially urban housing, the state of the food supply. So I've talked a bit about milk. I could do a whole separate presentation on milk and TB, but I won't. Alcohol abuse, again, this is the time of the temperance movement too. Childhood health, because as I said, children particularly were liable to quite vicious, nasty forms of TB that were hard to treat. So, and again, this is also the age of the great sentimentalization of the child. So there was a lot of energy devoted to trying to, give children a proper childhood free from the perils of like long-term disability. Workplace health, again, I could do a whole separate talk on this. I'll talk a bit more about this in the next section. And the economy too, because if you think about it, this is the age of empires. This is the age where, international competition on a global scale is something that countries like great nation states like Germany and the US and the UK and France are thinking more and more about. And, if we have a young generation or a generation of workers or soldiers who are afflicted with TB and, can't work or can't fight in our armies because of the effects of TB, we have to do something about this. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to what is seen as a turning point in the history of TB, which is the identification of Mycobacterium tuberculosis by a German bacteriologist called Robert Koch. You can see him here on a lovely stamp again. So yeah, he identifies Mycobacterium tuberculosis as what he sees as the most important factor in causing TB. Again, when you often see these like big histories of of medical discoveries, a lot of the time it's phrased as if like, you know, people woke up in 1882 one morning to the news of this discovery and then everyone fell in line straight away. Whereas in actuality, there was a huge amount of debate about, you know, well, exactly how important is this germ in causing TB and how is it transmitted and is everyone equally susceptible? And despite the great optimism about this discovery and the potential for it posed potential for a cure for TB, so, you know, Koch's great rival in this period, Louis Pasteur over in France, you know, does a lot of great things with his work. So, you know, developing a great a suitable vaccine for rabies, for example. And there's a hope, you know, amongst a lot of people that, you know, now that we found a causative agent for TB, are we going to develop an effective treatment? But in actuality, it's only until the 1940s. So you have to wait a long time for an effective antibiotic treatment for TB. And so the association between the family and TB never entirely uncoupled. So many medical practitioners still saw tuberculosis as the trigger for someone with a hereditary predisposition to develop the disease rather than causing it in and of itself. And so you see stuff like life insurance companies in this period, which hire doctors, still assessing potential customers for the potential family taint of TB. So I'm going to go back a couple of things, slides. And here is a model life history form from Reginald Thompson's Family Phylogenetic, I can never pronounce it, where it was for insurance doctors to essentially write down the family history of tuberculosis. And again, you know, thinking about, you know, ideas take a long time to gain hold and gain traction and consensus from the medical community. Note that this was published 2 years after Koch's discovery. And there was also this popular belief that it was a hereditary disease or that tuberculosis ran in the family. It was also continued amongst, you know, non-medical practitioners too, so the lay people. So, for example, I haven't been able to find an equivalent for anywhere else, but in post-war Ireland, for example, there were surveys that carried out that showed that much of the general population still thought that TB ran in the family, and that way it could be a very, very stigmatizing disease. Okay, so now I'm going to go through quickly a history of diagnosing TB, and this is actually where medicine in this period does make quite a lot of strides. So in the early 19th century, tuberculosis really emerges as quite a distinct disease through the development of Paris medicine. And this is, I won't go too much into it, but this man here, René Laennec, he developed the stethoscope in the 1820s, and this helped to sort of distinguish TB from other kinds of respiratory diseases. This is from a diorama from the Science Museum, and I felt the need to put it here because the Science Museum History of Medicine dioramas are now gone, and there's a much fancier History of Medicine gallery, but I have a very big sentimental attachment to these dioramas because when I was a PhD student at the Science Museum, they were always there. So yeah, I just want to represent them here. So, you know, using the stethoscope continues to be a very important diagnostic tool for tuberculosis. Then we kind of go on to Koch's discovery of the presence of TB bacilli in sputum. So that develops into the sputum test for TB and becomes really probably the most cost-effective and ubiquitous means for verifying a case of TB in this period. Then you have the tuberculin test, which is like a skin reaction test. So there's a very interesting history of tuberculin. It was essentially a therapeutic thing designed by Koch to treat TB, and in actuality it never worked out. There was quite a lot of controversy and drama around the fact that it wasn't effective in treating TB, but what people did find was it was actually quite good for diagnosing it. And then finally we have X-ray. So the X-rays were used medically from the late 1890s onwards, but really grew in popularity in interwar and post-war period. And what you saw a lot in the post-war period, which I can't speak very authoritatively on because I very much, my comfort level as a historian stops after 1945. They would have these mobile X-ray units that would go around the major cities X-raying people for TB, and the most famous of which actually took place in Glasgow, where you could get x-rayed for TB and entered into a prize draw to win a car or go on holiday. But that's a talk for another time. Okay, then thinking a bit more about treating TB in the sanatorium. So I think everyone's fairly familiar with the sanatorium. I think it's something that looms quite large in our popular imagination of TB. So the first specialist TB sanatorium opens around the middle of the 19th century in Germany, and it's generally considered the first place for specialist treatment for TB. And whilst, at the sanatorium, you would be receiving medicine, and very occasionally, much later on, you would maybe be undergoing surgery to treat your disease. The most important thing about the sanatorium was its regime, and it's the fact that it really emphasized the importance of discipline, diet, exercise, and fresh air. And the fresh air component was really important. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the images of people in deck chairs sleeping outside in sanatoria. The idea was, we would get the poor tuberculous subject from the city, where he suffers from terrible air pollution, overcrowding, and take him to, the beautiful Swiss mountains or the refreshing countryside air of England. And it really did continue to be a popular treatment option throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, because there was no magic bullet for curing TB in this period, right? And in fact, it once, originally it's the domain of the rich, the sanatorium treatment, but the 1911 National Insurance Act, which in Britain is a compulsory insurance scheme for people earning under a certain amount, provides access to sanatoria for workers for the first time. I say for some here because, whilst you might think this piece of legislation was very progressive and, must have changed lives for so many people, working class people suffering from TB, in actuality, demand often outstripped supply, and there wasn't enough beds for everyone who wanted to go to the sanatorium. And I thought I'd also run you through some other treatments for TB in this period, which are quite interesting. So on the far left, we have sanochrysine, which is the gold treatment for TB. This is basically, they found in laboratory conditions, gold was good at killing off some of the TB germs. And then in the interwar period, some Danish medical men ran with that idea. But often what would happen is you would get injected with TB, and as would happen, you get poisoned. You get high levels of gold toxicity in your system. So eventually, it was seen as perhaps not worth it in the end. Cod liver oil, which had been a really old treatment for TB way back into the 18th century, continued to be very popularly used, both in the sanatorium and outside. There was a lot of patent medicines for TB too. So this is a Schlick's pulmonary syrup. So, something you get from the chemist or order from mail order catalogue, was very popular. Also used to be dispensed at dispensaries for people. And here is the artificial pneumothorax machine, which really grew in popularity in the early 20th century for pulmonary TB. So what happens is often if you read biographies of people who were in these early working class sanatoria in the early 20th century, they will talk about the artificial pneumothorax machine with a great degree of fear, because essentially what would happen is the idea was that you needed to rest the diseased tubercular lung. So what would happen is they would inject your lung often without anesthesia, and they would artificially collapse it. And it was, by all accounts, from what you read, it was a very painful and quite traumatizing experience for those who underwent this procedure. Okay, so now I'm going to look at tuberculosis in Scotland and its relationship to the Post Office. Okay, so I'm going to concentrate a bit on tuberculosis rates in Scotland, which actually showed a lot in common more generally at the time with tuberculosis rates in Europe. So as you can see here, tuberculosis from around the 1870s onwards is gradually killing less and less people in Scotland, to the point where by 1958, it's causing 13 in every 100,000 deaths. It's actually interesting though, there's a very interesting post-war history of tuberculosis in Scotland, in that in actuality, it's seen as a black spot on the map of Europe, because TB cases still continue to be quite high, and they spike at various points. And there's lots of questions as to what is making Scotland unique? What is making tuberculosis rates in Scotland rise versus the rest of the UK and the rest of Europe? So historians have identified historical tuberculosis spread in Scotland as really tied into the Scottish economy. So tying it a lot with rural outmigration. So this idea that as a young working age male, you would leave your village, go to a city or a town to work for a bit and then return. But obviously, as you return, you also bring disease with you. The disease is associated with urban living. So that was one factor. Another thing was the textile industry, which was very, very big, especially in the west coast of Scotland. And if you think about all the things today we know about COVID and social distancing, these would have been very large workplaces with quite poor ventilation, people working very, very close together. And often they were women. And the interesting thing here is historians have speculated why TB rates were higher amongst women. And one of the reasons it suggested it is that women probably suffered nutritionally compared to men in the family unit. The men would have received more food, more nutritious food. So women's immune system probably wouldn't have been as strong in fighting TB because their diet was relatively quite poor compared to male. And obviously women worked a lot in the Scottish textile industry. And then related to this, overcrowding and urbanisation was another key risk factor in Scotland. By 1914, over 40% of the population lived in towns. But really housing in late 19th, turn of the century Scotland is an incredibly big political hot potato, right? And it is recognised that housing conditions in Scotland are generally incredibly poor. Another interesting thing about the history of TB in Scotland is the role played by trade unions in campaigning for TB as a public health issue, campaigning for greater access to treatment, campaigning for greater awareness and so on, but also for getting it recognised as a prescribed occupational disease. So it's a disease where you could eventually, if it turned out you couldn't work anymore due to this condition, which many people couldn't with TB, as again, like I said, it's a long, slow killer. What you would be able to do is if you could prove you contracted TB at work, you could eventually claim for your employer for compensation and then live off that compensation. It takes a long time for them to do this. TB is only recognised as an occupational disease in 1951. But as I said, Scottish trade unions were really instrumental in doing that. And here I want to think a bit more about the role played by the family, but particularly played by overcrowding and the family unit. So this case comes from a really great PhD I found from the year I was born, actually, by Neil Monroe McFarlane, called Tuberculosis in Scotland, 1870 to 1960. It's free online. Go download it. It will probably be much more informative than this talk. But something that McFarlane did, which was really great, was he interviewed Scottish people who contracted TB in the post-war period, including woman E or patient E, who was a Rob Royston woman who got TB when she was 18 years old. And what is interesting about this case is you can see the variety of factors relating to the family unit that led to this family really suffering from the effects of TB. So the fact that they lived 10 people in a 2-bedroom flat, 3 to 1 bed. So again, that's a big factor if you're coughing next to someone. The father was unemployed, and as a result of that, their diet was very, very poor. So again, the diet was, probably a factor in so many of them falling unwell. And again, just like we see today with COVID, there's a big domino effect. So, father comes in with TB, then the mother dies, then patient E gets TB, but she eventually recovers. But then other people in her family aren't so lucky. So her eldest sister contracts TB and dies. And the youngest child gets tubercular meningitis, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a form of TB, especially associated with young age, and is quite a nasty, very hard type of TB to treat. So how did Scottish medicine react to this problem of TB in Scotland? So the most influential contribution that Scottish medicine made to tuberculosis treatment in this period was something called the Edinburgh System. And this was designed by a man called Robert William Phillip, who opened the Victoria Dispensary for Consumption and Diseases of the Chest in Edinburgh in 1887. And the reason why Phillip opened this dispensary is because he had a long history of working in working class dispensaries in Edinburgh. So these dispensaries would provide free or low cost outpatient care to the working classes. Philip had worked at the Newtown dispensary in Edinburgh, but he was really frustrated with the standard of care for chronic TB patients. So he said what he would see someone who would just come back again and again, and they would just be given cough syrup and told to go on their way. And he thought, you know, there has to be a way to deal with this, that there has to be a better means of trying to arrest the spread of TB, because, you know, that person is then spreading TB in their, through their family and friends and so forth. So in the absence of a really effective like therapeutic treatment for TB, education was really at the forefront of the Edinburgh system. So it was a concerted public health campaign. And as you can see here on the far left, you've got a really great relic of the Edinburgh system here, this little card that was given to patients, but also dispensed freely to people as well, where it tells you all these various rules for trying not to catch TB. So, you know, making sure you dust, keeping away from crowded places, keeping your teeth clean, because teeth were often thought as nests of germs in this period, keeping your window open, big thing. And keeping temperate, again, you know, making sure you don't drink too much, but also you don't eat too much rich food, and you kind of keep a regular diet and so forth. But something else that was interesting about the Edinburgh system was, so what you would do is you would go and get assessed at the dispensary, and then they would sort of try and decide what to do with you. Often you would be sent to a sanatorium or to a farm colony. But the really interesting thing about it in relation to the family unit was the fact that they had a really extensive system of visiting homes. So patients were visited by doctors, nurses, and health visitors from the dispensary. Around 3,000 visits in 1904, which is quite a lot. And as you can see, really what they're doing is they're making sure that these dispensary patients are living by these rules on the left. So they're making sure, you know, that they're dusting and that they're maybe not sharing cutlery, and, you know, they're keeping their windows open and so forth. And another important role that the family unit played in the Edinburgh system was as they were sort of targeted, right, for trying to detect if they had TB. So when you were a patient, if you come to the dispensary and say, yeah, I think I have TB, your family would have to come, and your family would be marched past the doctors and this line of inspection, and they would try and tell whether, you know, so-and-so had characteristic signs of TB, how their chest sounded and so forth. And this is a really great picture that I'd never actually seen before I designed, I sort of made up this talk, which is a dispensary nurse visiting an infected house in Edinburgh. You can see here her on the, you know, on the rather austere uniform. And yeah, I thought this was great for really emphasizing, you know, how the family unit was really central. So the idea of targeting the family unit was really central to the Edinburgh system. Okay, so you might be wondering, what on earth does the Edinburgh system have to do with TB in the post office? So the Edinburgh system is incredibly important for sort of setting a precedent for how to treat TB in large targeted populations, right? And it provides the inspiration and the model for TB treatment for probably the most important worker-led health movement in the post office in this period, which is the Post Office Sanatorium Society. So this is a friendly society. So friendly societies are like mutual insurance schemes where you would pay a certain amount weekly or monthly, and you would be provided sickness insurance and from the society. So the Post Office Sanatorium Society was established in 1903 to help combat what its founder, Charles Garland, who was originally a telegrapher's clerk, saw as a growing epidemic in the post office. So Garland claims something like 40% of telegraph clerks died of TB, male telegraph clerks. I'm really not sure Garland was completely right with his figures, but he mounted a really convincing case. He was really good friends with a lot of these very high profile philanthropists involved with TB, friends with a lot of TB specialists, and really got the medical profession on his side. So he was writing a lot to medical journals, complaining about conditions in the post office, and agitating for change and for things to be done. So what they do is in 1903, they set up this friendly society, and it's a means of dispensing education and raising awareness. And it casts itself in the Edinburgh system, which uses like this radial model of TB education. So this idea that you have a central hub of information, and then it moves outwards and grows. So it's like a multi-level marketing scheme or a pyramid scheme, right? But what distinguished the sanatorium system was it was very much emphasized that the worker would be the unit of communication. So the working classes would communicate and fight this together. So it was less of a paternalistic model than the Edinburgh system, which, you know, had very much these well-to-do nurses coming, visiting working class homes and checking that people were, you know, living correctly. This was much more worker-led and about working class respectability. But the other thing that the Sanatorium Society took from the Edinburgh system was the ways in which the sanatorium and the home were seen as spaces that should become more like one another. So really, so the Sanatorium system, the Sanatorium Society established its own sanatorium in 1906 in Kent. Benenden, which is today Benenden Healthcare. So this is the origins of Benenden Healthcare, for those of you who know it. And what they do at the Benenden is they really emphasize this idea of the rules of health. So the thing we saw with the little card back here. So they sort of create their own version of this. And this is the instructions to patients of the National Sanatorium, where it talks about here on the right, it's the end of the booklet where it's talking about what you should do when you get home. So it's not, you know, the rules for lunchtime at the sanatorium, or like, you know, this, you need to make your bed this way. This is about once you're out in the world, what you need to do. And the idea is basically to replicate sanatorium life in your own home. So getting regular exercise, you know, regular meal times as well. Again, a real symbol of institutional life. Disinfection of sputum. If you use handkerchiefs to spit, let them be boiled for half an hour before being washed. Boil your laundry, you know. So take all these precautionary measures that, you know, you see in the sanatorium and replicate them outside. And so whilst the Sanatorium Society, from what I can remember, does not have branches in Scotland itself or in Ireland, it's really important anyway to see how Scottish medicine in particular had this really important influence, I think, on the Sanatorium Society and provided a model for work-led activity and agitation against TB. Okay, so my conclusion's not great because A, I'm terrible at writing conclusions, and B, when I was practicing this, it kept on running over. I'm sorry if I've done that again. But essentially, I just want to conclude by thanking you for coming with me on this TB's family history journey from East Africa to Edinburgh. And I guess just a shout out here for the project in general, the Addressing Health project. But I'm really interested as a historian of TB, and now as someone who works a lot with family historians as part of this project, really interested to hear if anyone has any questions or thoughts. My email's there, because I know a lot of you may well be family historians, and I'm really interested to think about people's own family histories of TB and play around a bit with that. So, you know, if you have any questions or thoughts or ideas or anything you want to talk about really with regards to TB in the family, just let me know. And yeah, I will stop now because I'm sure everyone's got some questions and my throat is getting incredibly croaky. So I'll stop sharing now.